Okay, let's talk about public safety really quick.
Sure.
Recently in the Atkinson community, there was a community meeting where Commander Solberg told residents, hey, we just don't have the resources to reallocate to, handle a large number of burglaries. Do you think DC's police force is adequate at the numbers they have now, at the current numbers, or, do you think that we need more? I know Phil Middleton's, been battling back and forth with the unions about that.
Well, I'll tell you this. There's some folks who are on both sides of the issue. Folks who think they want the levels to raise up to 4,000. I mean, that's been an argument over the last so many years. And where they currently are, some folks think it's inadequate. I'd say look at the statistics. Yes, robberies are up, right? And some of the other quality of life crimes like thefts, thefts from vehicles and things like that, right? But when you look at the statistics in 2011, what you notice is that violent crime in general is down. And crime in general is down as well. And so the issue that presents is that if you look at the force where it currently is, which is less than 4,000, somewhere hovering around 3,700 to 3,800, depending on attrition, and you say, if we can do what we did in 2011 at where the rate of what they are right now, then why do we necessarily need to pump more money into taking it up to 4,000? I think obviously we need to keep the academy going and make sure that we got a sufficient number of new recruits to replace the attrition of the folks who are retiring. But I think that the chief is doing a good job right now. I think that in terms of addressing issues like robberies, it's about allocation of resources. It's about redeployment of your resources. So I think that's a strategy that has to take place with the folks in MPD to decide what's the best use of the resources that they currently have. And I think they've been doing things, and I know from working in the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Public Safety and Justice, obviously I can't disclose in confidence the things that I learned in that office, but I know that the chief is working daily, looking at the numbers as they come in to redeploy resources where necessary. But I also know that all that stuff I just told you about statistics doesn't really matter when you're the one who's a victim of a crime. And being a victim of a temporary burglary myself when I was home, I also know that we need to make sure that community policing is just isn't a catchphrase, and that it's something that's meaningful not only to the police department but for the residents of Ward 5. And so, I think that community policing does not only mean that we need to see more officers walking the beat, that we need to see more officers on segways and bicycles. That's definitely part of that recipe. But I think the other part of that recipe, and I think Kathy will agree with me, is that you got to have more participation from residents. You got to have folks who see something. You see a kid that lives 3 doors down from you breaking in a car, so don't just tell his mom. Call the police. We can't keep giving folks a slap on the wrist. We got to hold individuals accountable. That includes adults. And so I think, as well as part of that recipe, residents have to make sure that they're more participatory. When you get the U.S. Attorney, when you get MPD who catches a criminal, and the U.S. Attorney's Office or the Office of the Attorney General who prosecutes them and gets a conviction, then write a community impact statement. Support your public safety officials. And I'm pledging to work with law enforcement partners to make sure that we bring community policing, to make sure it's a real thing for Ward 5.
All right, we're going to get to a few questions from the residents, and then our wonderful chef wanted. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to get to Ms. Henderson and have some more interesting questions for these guys. But let's go to the questions from the audience. Right here.
Hi, Commissioner Shaw, 5805. You talked about DSLBD. DSLBD, is my understanding, is an advocacy group. There's a limited number of employees there, but under the previous administration, they lost a grant from the Department of Defense for their public assistance and technical assistance program. So I guess my question would be, given the news headlines of the last 3 days about small businesses and minority businesses in the District of Columbia not being paid millions of dollars from the President's AAR Act, Recovery Act, what would you do with the Office of Procurement and Contracting as opposed to DSLBD and increasing staff to a group that is an advocacy group and really an administrative function for CBEs in the District of Columbia?
That's an excellent question, and I'm glad you asked that question. And at the risk of sounding a little wonky and putting some folks to sleep, what I realized is that the Office of Contract and Procurement not only presents problems to small businesses, it also presents problems to nonprofits in the city. There's a nonprofit study, and I can't remember, I can't cite to it directly, but I was talking to a guy who's a leader in the nonprofit community, and he told me about how the city is ranked 4th for late payments of nonprofits around the country. They're also ranked first in the complexity of the application to become a nonprofit. And so one of the issues that I think the Office of Contract and Procurement has is that you got agencies who want to pay vendors, or they want to put out an RFP to get some critically needed resources. They've got to go through OCP, right? And the problem is you got folks who are bureaucrats at OCP who don't necessarily have the technical expertise to evaluate those vendors like the agencies do. And for the most part, it's been boiling down to dollars and cents. And that's a problem. It's a problem when the Office of Contract and Procurement is being driven by trying to get the least expensive deal or the least expensive vendor at the expense of quality services and making sure that we can pay out our vendors who already provided services, not only the small businesses, but also the nonprofits. So that's something that I know very well, and that's something that definitely needs to be overhauled. We need to look how, OCP, the protocols are currently in place for how they evaluate and draw up RFPs, but also the timeliness in which they pay vendors. I mean, there are folks, particularly small businesses and nonprofits, who are robbing Peter to pay Paul, who are trying to get money from this pot to pay bills because the city hasn't paid their invoices. And that's a problem. You got nonprofits and businesses that are closing up shop not because they aren't doing business and generating revenues that they should be paid, but the city is taking too long to pay them. And so I completely agree with you, and I think that's one of the areas in the city that definitely needs to be looked at and overhauled to put in place some greater efficiencies and make sure that we're not just driven strictly by how much we pay out, but make sure we look more closely at the quality of the services and the timeliness in which we pay people.
And let me follow up with that question to the first candidate. Since you have been in the legislative branch, the DC Auditor's Office put out an extensive study and report concerning non-payment of small businesses in the District of Columbia. And of course, with all due respect to our chairman of the City Council member, Kwame Brown, that report was ignored. So what was your response in terms of supporting the report from the DC Auditor's Office?
We held a hearing on it, on payments to local businesses and hiring of local residents. We didn't get much traction on actual follow-up. One of the biggest problems we have in the city, we legislate all day long, but we don't enforce the laws on the books. We over-legislate, and then they abdicate the duty to actually go behind and make sure that those laws are being enforced. Again, like my colleague here, not to get too wonky, I wrote the legislation that created the Department of Small and Local Business. Before that, it was an office. It had few people in it. We bumped it up to an agency that was a cabinet level agency, and made it have different divisions as far as business development, certification, what have you. And like you said, they went away from that. They went away from the framework we put in place, and the quality started going up again. And it became just a place where you go just to get certified and you get lost in a hole. So it's about enforcement, really. We don't need to legislate much more. We need to enforce the laws on the books now.
You mentioned business development along our corridors like Rhode Island Avenue, Bladensburg Road, and other areas. And you also mentioned that the role that small business microlenders play into that. That's a good role. Organizations like LADC, WASIF, I think you mentioned specifically. Well, the program director of WASIF actually, in response to a small business looking for assistance on Bladensburg Road, replied back and saying, I would like to see you address some security concerns. There is a stigma that 8th Street Northeast is not safe. Bladensburg Road might be a stretch for people already thinking they're in a rough part of town. And basically denied funding as a result of that stigma that it's not a safe part of town. So as a small business owner, how are you supposed to get funding from these sources that you say are going to fix the small business problem when we have these security concerns and they won't lend the money?
Well, I mean, it's sort of like the broken window theory, and it's going to be tough to really to address that issue until you can really get funding to these small businesses, and so the ones that exist can reinvest in their businesses to make sure they have capital. Because some of these national and larger financial institutions aren't, giving them loans that they need, particularly when you start talking about minority businesses. And so, in order to make sure that we've got the funding available, I think one of the things we need to do is make better use of our community banks. The problem with what you just said is that, wasted denied funding because, the safety concern. How many resources can MPD devote to a small business corridor when there aren't a lot of business that currently exist? There isn't a lot of foot traffic. And so it's sort of, you caught between a rock and a hard place in that because, you can't devote too many, public safety resources because there's not a whole lot of stuff there. You can't capture those tax dollars from Maryland and Virginia because it's not really an attractive place to do business. And so for folks who have opened up businesses, the problem is we got to make sure that we can support them where they are because otherwise they're going to end up closing up shop. We can't be bringing in these larger retailers, retailers and establishments to put our small businesses out of business. That's the problem. And, if you follow that model, then you're never going to get folks who really want to open up small businesses. And I think that's something that we need to try to work on.
In the back.
What's your position on medical marijuana facilities in Ward 5, and are there any advantages to having them here?
Medical marijuana clearly is a hot topic of debate right now. I think part of what has been a part of that debate is sort of the history of Ward 5. And being a native Washingtonian and a lifelong resident of Ward 5, this perception that Ward 5 has been a dumping ground. And to some, it's not merely a perception. You look at the trash transfer stations that we've been placed with. You look at sort of the strip clubs that have popped up or the desire to relocate strip clubs in Ward 5. And folks have really taken issue, particularly folks at ANC 5B who've been on the receiving end of some of these facilities. I say that to say that clearly there's a medical benefit and treatment to having marijuana dispensaries and cultivation centers in Ward 5. And I get it. You've got folks who are suffering, who badly need marijuana to help treat their ailments. And I support that. The question then becomes, though, the emergency legislation that was passed was essentially capped at around 6, right? And so my question is, we need to look more at not just capping it at 6 because that was about the amount of applicants that you had in the pipeline when this legislation was being introduced. But we need to do a thorough analysis of the impact of these facilities on the community. And I think that's one. You sort of take a step back and see what the real impact is going to be on the community. The other thing is to try to harness the development that is going to come as a result of these facilities in the community. There are going to be tax dollars generated from these facilities, right? And so what I'm saying is, why not use those tax dollars directly for the folks in Ward 5, particularly in that area? Because you look at the New York Avenue corridor, you look at that, industrial corridor that we have in Ward 5, and naturally, if you're a business person, you're going to seek to locate there because the zoning is already beneficial. You've got, low-cost real estate that you can get. And so if I'm a business person, it makes sense to do that, right? But as a city, as a government, we got to make sure the community has a seat at the table when we're having that discussion on the front end. I think all too often when you talk about medical marijuana and some of the other issues around economic development, the community doesn't come into play until you get a developer that comes and says, this is what we're going to do. Take it or leave it. And I think that's been part of the problem. And so when you have the medical marijuana discussion, I think we need to focus on how we can use those tax dollars to improve economic development in that corridor. Because quite frankly, we need to do more development that people in the community want. And not just, the folks that who want to, from a business standpoint, who say, I want to locate here because it's beneficial to me. And so New York Avenue, again, is the gateway to the city. It should be a destination. I mean, people from all across Washington, D.C., not just Ward 5, but every ward in the city, people from Prince George's County, Montgomery County, Anne County, Northern Virginia, should all be wanting to come to New York Avenue, particularly the folks who commute to come to work at the federal government and the district government. They should have a reason to stop there and spend some money. This traffic's backed up on New York Avenue every single day if you go out there, right? But nobody's stopping to get out to buy anything to eat. They're not stopping to buy any clothes, and so I think that's something we need to address. I think we can use the tax revenue from medical marijuana to try to do that.